I'm Justin Glaw, writer and journalist, and I've spent my career chronicling the violence, unrest, and chaos of American life. On this podcast, I'll discuss the events roiling this complex and troubling country and speak with some of the people trying to make sense of the madness that pervades our world. This is American Doom. Hey everybody, welcome to the American Doom podcast. Today I'm talking with Teddy Wilson, who is a journalist and researcher who spends a lot of time looking into issues with far-right extremism in the United States. He writes a Substack newsletter, Radical Reports, which I suggest everyone check out. And for those who don't know already, American Doom is my newsletter over at Substack. It's at american-doom.com. And Teddy and I cover a lot of stuff that sort of intersects, so I wanted to talk with him about what he's seen in terms of right-wing extremism and radicalization. So stick around for our talk. You're intaking a pretty high volume of information about right-wing radicalism and extremism in the U.S. You know, what trends have you seen since you started it in 2020? And then, what have you seen maybe since Trump took office? And when you say that, your approach has changed a little bit, is that because of the changing nature of sort of like what radicalism looks like in the U.S. on the American right?
Well, I think the newsletter has changed and evolved a bit, both because of changes in the radical right and kind of my own analysis of the radical right and how I view it, and also changes based on kind of how people consume media and which features and how often people tend to I think read newsletters and other kinds of content. So it's changed and evolved to adapt to both kind of what I've been covering and how people who read my newsletter and other similar content respond to kind of what I produce. So I think as far as the changes within the radical right and the different parts of the far right, I think one of the biggest changes has really been in response to January 6th. So, and it's begun to change again in response to the pardons. And so this is kind of part of an evolution. It's part of a continuum. So when January 6th happened, when the Capitol riot happened, and in the following months and years, it became an event that I viewed, and many others that study the far right, both researchers and people within academia, people I've talked to, have come to view it as a really singular kind of event, a really important event within the far right and different elements. Movements within the far right, similar to the siege at Waco and the Branch Davidians, and similar to Ruby Ridge and the siege of the FBI's siege of the Christian identity adherents that were there. Both have kind of elements and connections to the militia movements, another part of the far right. And the far right really became, those two incidents really became a really singular focus of them, of being targeted and oppressed. It really went into and fed into really a long-standing mythology within the far right and extremist movements of being oppressed or being attacked or being under siege from, the federal government or other kind of shadowy organizations. And so January 6th took on that same mythology, I think. But then I think we're witnessing how that mythology has really dramatically changed almost overnight, right? Since President Donald Trump has issued his pardons and commutations of anyone convicted or charged with any crimes related to January 6th. It has, I think, started to and kind of is in the process of being viewed not no longer kind of part of the mythology of persecution and oppression. It is starting to be viewed, I think, as one of the singular kind of primary, almost sole kind of victory of the far right and the radical right. And in fact, the only thing that I think is comparable, and this is on a much smaller scale, is the standoff at the Bundy Ranch several years ago, and the fact that federal agents withdrew from the
Right.
Bundy Ranch. I think that is the only thing that is close in comparison to what I think this is going to be viewed at as within the far right. You know, they stormed the Capitol. They took over the Capitol. They took part in really horrific acts of violence against um, police officers and law enforcement. And then essentially they were rewarded for those actions by
Mm-hmm.
the president that they stormed the Capitol for 4 years later. And so I think it has created a really dangerous moment within kind of the radical right, and it has switched a lot of things as far as kind of how I view the kind of current landscape of the radical right. And I think I'm still kind of processing what all this means.
Yeah,
Um, and so, yeah, I think there's more kind of different elements to this. There's so many different parts to how I think this affects various parts within the radical right, whether you're talking about kind of the militia movement or the border vigilantes or the white supremacist movement or kind of the more violent accelerationist or even kind of the street level gang violence of kind of far right groups. There's a lot of kind of different parts to this that and I think the consequences of Trump's pardon were going to be kind of living out those consequences for the next years, and
for sure.
it's uh, it's a kind of a dangerous time, I think.
Well, it's interesting that you make the comparison in this continuum between the Branch Davidians at Waco and the standoff at Ruby Ridge, and that and its relation to the Capitol riot. Because when I think of the Capitol riot, the right wing the radical event that I think of is the Oklahoma City bombing and Timothy McVeigh. Right? It was these were the actors, right? We think about when I think about Waco, when I think about Ruby Ridge, I think you're right to you're definitely right to point out that like obviously they're viewing those people as the victims of an overreaching government. This was not an overreaching government in the case of the Capitol riot. It was them who are not taking responsibility for their own actions. So that's interesting though that then as a result of being held accountable for their actions, they now view it as sort of a Waco / Ruby Ridge thing. They attacked the Capitol, they got indicted, they got prosecuted, they got convicted. And so now they're the, sort of hapless victims in all of this when obviously they were engaged in something that, is was very clearly an attempted insurrection. Um so like I guess if they have sort of gotten away with this, like is there a does this like take down the temperature for these people, if they have sort of gotten off here and they don't have to worry about this cause that they had, right? The January 6 hostages, we've got to free them, we've got to save them. Have they gotten what they wanted enough in a way where they're going to take their foot off the gas because Trump's in the White House, Republicans control Congress, we've got a conservative majority on the Supreme Court, Republicans are doing whatever the hell they want to do in state legislatures across the country? Is this enough for the people who are lionizing the people who were involved in January 6th, or do they want more?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think one, I think we really won't know the answer to a lot of those kind of questions in the immediate future. It's going to take some time, but there are two elements that I would look at. One is, I think we are, as far as lowering the temperature, I think we are in a moment in which the activities, the amount of organizing, the kind of the temperature of the far right has been reversed in a lot of the ways that we've seen it previously historically. So typically what we've seen as far as how the activities and organizing when of the far right have ramped up, when we have seen much more action on the far right, has been when they perceive that they are out of power, right? So, the Oklahoma City bombing, as a response to these mythologies of persecution and oppression, took place during the presidency of Bill Clinton, during his first term. And I think that was a time in which we saw that 90s period when we saw a lot of far right organizing, not just from kind of the militia movement that Timothy McVeigh came out of, but also from white supremacist groups and neo-Nazi groups, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. And then later in the 2000s, when we saw another surge in far right violence, and organizing, particularly kind of when you talk about the violent surge there, it was primarily kind of anti-abortion violence during the Obama years, assassinations and other types of violence, but also kind of more organizing from various parts of the far right. And so you would think that when Trump came into power during his first term, when he was elected in 2016, and takes power in the White House in 2017, you would think that you would see a kind of a diminishment, a decrease in the amount of organizing activities of various far right groups now that they perceived that they were in power again. Like what we saw during the Reagan administration, and then and the George H.W. Bush, and then later when George W. Bush took power. But I think we really saw the opposite effect. We saw
Trump's first term was an anomaly, right? Because a Republican wins the White House and the temperature doesn't go down. And I mean, is that, to me, what that says is like my just guess is that that's directly related to the fact that Trump didn't take the temperature down, right? That like his entire first presidency, as is his entire political and personal life, just filled with one grievance after another, and one group or organization or political party, in the case of the Democrats, that he's placing blame on, that is riling these people up more and more. So they have 4 years of that. Then we hit 2020. Now the election gets stolen from them. So that whole time period, when typically we would normally see the temperature coming down a little bit because, a right-wing person is in power, we didn't have that sort of historical lull, right? Is that what you're saying?
Right. And so you saw a president that was willing to say things and engage in the kind of rhetoric that emboldened many elements of the far right. And then also leading up to January 6th, I think, a lot of people don't necessarily remember exactly like how long the rhetoric and that kind of campaign to convince Trump supporters and other elements of the far right that the election was stolen happened long before the election took place.
In fact, it started happening in 2016. After he won in 2016, one of the first things he did was he came out and he said, well, I actually won the popular vote too, because all these illegal immigrants voted for Hillary Clinton. I mean, he was doing election denialism even after his win in 2016, right? That was when it really all began.
Right, that's true. And then if you look at the statements that were coming out of the White House and other Republicans, I think really around January of 2020 is really when you see a ramp up to this rhetoric that is already claiming that the election is going to be rigged or stolen, and that rhetoric increased throughout the year. So by the time that the election happens, and by the time all those votes are counted within those first several weeks after the election, the table had essentially been set, right? And then you had just a significant amount of organizing leading up to January 6th as well, right? A lot of these people that took part in the Capitol riot also attended other marches, either kind of within their local community. A lot of them attended things like the Jericho March in Washington, D.C., or Stop the Steal rallies. And so you had this revving up of organizing and people traveling to different places. And so it was a long kind of lead up into January 6th. And I think now, thinking about our current state of things, kind of what the current landscape looks like, I think one is that we're seeing a similar thing happen now that we saw back in 2017, right? We have a president that is not turning down the heat, right? Is ratcheting up the heat in similar ways that he done in 2017. Many of these executive actions and the things are happening now remind me very explicitly of what happened within those first few weeks and months in 2017.
Yes, I agree.
The details are different, and what the
right. Instead of the Muslim ban, it's higher immigration enforcement. ICE has been given more leeway to basically just stop. So yeah,
right.
There's a lot of similarities, right? And then this time DEI now is the thing, right? And yeah. I guess that I wonder, like, continue your thought, but I wonder what the next thing that riles everyone up to some sort of culmination is going to be, because that's clearly going to happen, I think.
Right. And we can talk about that too, because there's ways to think about that. But I would say finally thinking about kind of the landscape of the far right and where we are right now. I think, one of the other effects of January 6th that happened was similar to what happened after Charlottesville. So when the Unite the Right rally happened in Charlottesville, and you had all these white supremacists and other kind of far right extremists engage in really violent actions like killing people there in Charlottesville, Virginia, you had a crackdown, both from federal law enforcement, but also state and other law enforcement on all of these different groups. And so that led to a splintering, particularly that you saw within the white supremacist movement, where you had various groups come out of that, right? So Patriot Front is a group I think a lot of people are very familiar with right now, as far as kind of visible white supremacist, neo-fascist groups. Patriot Front came out of the splintering from Vanguard America, which splintered up after the Unite the Right rally. So you had other similar groups kind of splinter and branch off, and you had this kind of moment of where there was leadership vacuums in these different movements. You saw a similar thing happen after January 6th, where you had a lot of these groups were really aggressively targeted and prosecuted by federal prosecutors, and some of these groups, like the Oath Keepers, basically ceased to exist within a year or two as a national organization. Even local affiliates, there was, at the end of this year, there was only a handful of kind of local affiliates of the Oath Keepers that most of them had even rebranded to other names. The Proud Boys had diminished for a while, but then we saw a resurgence in the Proud Boys, and the Proud Boys are kind of, I think, a model that we saw in other far right groups associated with January 6th, in that no longer were these groups focused on kind of national level leadership structures. They were focused much more on kind of locally focused organizations autonomous to kind of the national structure. So the Proud Boys looks much different now than it did 4 or 5 years ago. There is no longer kind of a central leadership structure behind it. There's not kind of a national group controlling all these chapters. You have multiple chapters in multiple kind of states and communities that operate very differently than each other, both in terms of their visibility, who they organize with, who they seem politically aligned with, their propensity to violence. So like a lot of the Proud Boys in, say, Ohio have been much more focused on like showing up at protests, but they are less prone to violence and kind of street level thuggery than we've seen in, say, the Proud Boy groups in South Texas that have been much more prone to kind of violent actions and getting to kind of street fights. Same with like kind of a lot of the Proud Boy groups and their affiliates in Southern California. So we've seen this kind of evolution within these far right groups. Now, here's the question that we come up against is, we have all of these people that have been pardoned for the Capitol riot. Most of them had already served their time. And so there was, I think, between 100 and 200 people that were in prison or in jail when Trump signed his pardons and commutations that were released from custody. Many of these people are leaders or were former leaders of these various far-right extremist groups. For most of them, if they received pardons, with the exception of the handful that received commutations, I think they are leaving, prison and no longer in custody. They are not subject to kind of monitoring or kind of parole
or restrictions on possession and ownership of firearms. Right. They get a commutation for a felony. They can go out and buy a gun and, carry it with them if there's a concealed carry law in that state, all of this stuff.
Right. And so now the question is, how are these individuals going to filter back into the far right? And
will they?
I think for a lot of the people that have been previously involved in the far right extremist movements, a lot of the people just that were involved in the Capitol riot that weren't necessarily directly affiliated with far right extremist movements, I think that from everything that I've seen, from public statements that they've said in either the media or on social media, the vast majority of these people, they do not regret their actions, with the exception of many of them that were involved in kind of violence against police officers have said that maybe they shouldn't have done that. Yeah. But as far as being at the Capitol, protesting, believing kind of the lies and misinformation about the 2020 election, being loyal to President Trump, all that has seemingly remained the same. And so I think there's a big question as far as like whether or not they will be involved in the movement. I think it's highly likely that you'll see a lot of these people get involved in either, everything from far right extremist groups kind of filtering back into involvement in local politics, to other kinds of right-wing activism.
Yes.
I think that's highly likely. The real question then for me, as someone that follows these people and tracks them, is like, what will their influence be? And will they continue to kind of have a following and be leaders within the movement? Because all of these people are not viewed equally within the movement. Say, for example, Enrique Tarrio, who was the former leader of the Proud Boys, there's a real division within kind of the kind of current members of the Proud Boys in different places, and kind of different people within the far right about Tarrio, because while some view him as kind of a heroic figure and think he was wrongfully prosecuted They'll point to the fact that he wasn't physically there on January 6th, even though there is like a tremendous amount of evidence that he was deeply involved in the planning and coordination of these events leading up to it. Some view him as basically a snitch, that they think that he turned on the movement by cooperating with prosecutors. And several other members of both the Proud Keepers, Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, and others that um, many who have pled guilty gave witness testimony and cooperated with prosecutors are also viewed as turncoats and traitors to the movement. And so it's going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out over time. And even people like Stuart Rhodes, the former leader of the Oath Keepers, I think for many within the movement, like he is viewed similarly as a heroic figure by some, but there's many people, particularly within um, the more kind of community-based militia groups, kind of the ones that are not really public facing, the ones that spend most of their time actually out in the woods, kind of the movement that Timothy McVeigh was more touched into, kind of view him as a clownish figure.
Sure.
And so there are kind of different views about these people, and it's kind of a wait and see on what happens. I think the biggest thing as far as the heat is that Donald Trump has given these people a permission structure to engage in real world violence.
Right.
And so I think in addition to what this movement looks like in a year or two, and who are the prominent figures and how the movement's organizational structures have changed, and all of that. I think another one of the questions is how many people are emboldened to the point in which they think we can engage in something similar to January 6th. I think in talking to other experts, I think it's highly likely that we could see similar acts of violence and on localized levels. So we've already seen similar events happen in state legislatures, not to like such a degree that we saw on January 6th. We saw, a few dozens of people do things similar in the Michigan state legislature and the Oregon state legislature. I think it remains highly likely that we'd see something like that happen again in other state legislatures, or even much more localized. And you can imagine, I think, something happening, taking over a school board,
Right.
or taking over a county commission or something like that. I think that is highly likely that we would see something like that happen. And I think it is almost guaranteed that if something like that happened, you would see the president. I think his initial reaction would be defend the people taking those actions.
And indeed, they did briefly talk about this in the lead up to the election. There was Ivan Reichman in Pennsylvania talking about when it came time for the state legislature to do its job and allocate the electoral college votes for Pennsylvania, if it didn't go Trump's way, hey, maybe we should send some people there to disrupt the work of the state legislature in regards to the electoral college. So like that's clearly coming from the playbook of January 6th. And obviously that was well before, Trump got elected and the pardons. But I mean, I think it's important, something that you pointed out, to say that it may not necessarily be that the people themselves who were released as a result of these pardons and commutations are themselves going to cause another January 6th or get super deeply involved in these far right movements and groups, but it's potentially more about the message that it sends to the entire sort of ecosystem of right-wing extremists that like this is okay. The attack on the Capitol was okay. So therefore, if you guys want to interrupt a county commission meeting or take over a library board or whatever it is, you have my, as president, explicit permission to do so, right?
And I think it will also give, I think a lot of the people that come out of this with pardons and commutations, I also think you'll see a lot of people um, use it to their advantage as far as kind of having a certain amount of street cred, right? They will always be able to say that they went to jail for Donald Trump.
Right.
And so I think, in addition to
they'll be able to make money on Mike Flynn's Reawakening tour for the rest of their lives, right? I mean, this is a lifelong grift now for some of these people.
Well, I think even more than that, I think that you will see some of these people, in addition to possibly being involved in different ways in the different kind of far-right extremist groups, I think you will see a significant number of these people will be involved in Republican politics, local and state level politics. I think you will see a lot of these people running for state legislature or other types of higher office, either kind of on the local level, state, maybe even federal level. I think you will see a lot of these people kind of use that as a way to kind of gain even more political power. And I think that the seeds have already been sowed for that, because we've seen people run for office already who were already convicted of being involved in January 6th. Some were awaiting trial that ran for office. You've also seen involvement of a lot of these far-right groups more directly in Republican Party politics on the local level. There's been a lot of Proud Boys that have had direct involvement in local Republican Party politics. So I think that you'll see a lot of these people become even more directly involved in kind of Republican politics at various levels.
Which just speaks to the ongoing and increased radicalization of the Republican Party. That these once too radical members are now sort of like mainstream. So Teddy, thank you so much for talking with us today. Can you tell folks where to find your work and let us know how we can keep on top of what you're covering?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on. You can find my work at radicalreports.org. That's where my newsletter is based. You can sign up for a subscription there. I have free subscriptions, also different levels of paid subscriptions if you want to sign up and support my work. You can find me on most social media, although it's almost all of it is, you can find me Report by Wilson. Although primarily right now, most of my activity has been on Blue Sky. So that's kind of where I post most of the things that I'm reporting on or covering. So that's kind of where you can find me at these days.
Awesome. Well, you're doing great work. Thank you so much again, and we'll get back with you soon.
Sure thing. Love to come back on anytime.
Thanks, Teddy. Thank you for listening to American Doom. This podcast is just a part of my work as a writer and journalist. To keep up, or at least to try to, because chaos and speed are the two primary drivers of my work, you can subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just search for American Doom there, and you'll find the investigations and stories that I cover. Coming up on my newsletter are more dives into election deniers working as local election officials across the country. This is work I've been doing mostly by myself for the last 4 years, and it's not possible without your support. American Doom is the only place that you'll find reporting on local election denier officials. So if you support this effort to protect against threats to democracy, please subscribe to my newsletter, American Doom, on Substack. Thank you.